Okay, so as promised, I have an example for you of my own pre-writing for a poem that I'm working on. Um, and this is using a different poem. This poem is called The Fury of Overshoes by Anne Sexton. So I'm not going to have the same words as you, but I went through the same exercise that you did. And someone did the same thing. They read a poem to me, and I wrote some words down, and then I wrote a poem, which you're going to see in a little bit. Um, for those of you that thought that are using this model and you find it really helpful, and you're wondering why didn't you just put this in the last video? I know that it's really nice to kind of see the model and then do the work, but with poetry, the words and how they sound, how they look on page, and their meaning are all kind of equally important in poetry. And it's not necessarily the case with the other kinds of genres, right? Like how the novel looks on page doesn't matter usually. There are cases where it does, but usually doesn't matter as much as it does in poetry. And also how they sound. And poets are always concerned with how they sound as well. And so I wanted to take you through an exercise where you just listen to the sound of the words and what words kind of hit your ear naturally. So that's why I didn't show you my writing up front. I wanted you to experience the listening piece alone without the visual of the words yet. But here's my example. So the poem was The Fury of Overshoes, and these are the words that stood out to me. Nothing of it, slipstone, fury, night light, teddy thumb, giant steps, winter snow, buckle up, tie, cut, tears, and fish. Okay. So I did that. And then for the 2 minutes, I was trying to make a connection. And I'll be honest, I think that this connection was made because I was thinking about the rap battle and how Lin-Manuel Miranda and Tariq Trotter had to come up with those ideas off the cuff, and we're kind of riffing off each other. I mean, you might have heard them shout out each other a little bit. And so I was thinking about jazz musicians. This is also Tracy. It's kind of analogy when doing this exercise is that jazz musicians riff off each other. They kind of hear a melody and play it, parts of it that are important, and then kind of take it their own direction. And that's kind of what we're doing here. We're taking words from a poem, and then we're going to take them in our own direction. So music and jazz are in my mind. Plus, we're doing this unit about music. Some of the things we're reading are about music. And so for all those reasons, this is kind of what was bubbling up. So nothing of it, fury, cut, tears, and I actually used fish too, I think. Giant steps, night lights, and these words, for whatever reason, made me think of the topic of jazz. I think it was Giant Steps because that's a famous jazz album. It's the title of a famous jazz album. So that's probably where all this came from. Okay, but those are my words. That's my connection, and that's what my poem is going to be about. So then I took 5 minutes, and this is the draft I came up with. Giant steps, jazz music, musicians riffing off of one another, notes sleeping in the air like fish sleeping, leapfrogging each other, a school in flight, giant steps, music belonging to big people, nothing to it but their fury and tears. So you can see I kind of highlighted this, the words that I used. I didn't use all of them from the first one. And I probably should have highlighted fish because that was actually in my pre-writing and I skipped that one. Okay, really short first poem. But you can see I'm thinking about some elements of poetry. I'm thinking about how the words sound. I'm thinking about kind of how it looks on page. I wanted it to kind of look like it's floating freely, like kind of like jazz music kind of sounds like it's floating all over the place. And I have a simile here and some imagery, and I'm playing with the words that I had, playing with how it looks on page, and kind of thinking about the poetic elements as well. This line, riffing off each other, if you don't know what that means, riffing just means like bouncing off each other and adding to the idea. So people do this in comedy, people do this in rap battles, people do this in music. They hear somebody do something, and then they try to add to it and make it their own and take some of what they used. It's like improv. All right, so this draft took me about 3 or 4 minutes to put together after I had my words. I know that sounds kind of fast. If you need more time, absolutely fine. But I wanted to add a little more because I don't really have a shift. I didn't use all the words. I feel like I didn't really give you enough imagery to see the jazz musicians, things like that. So I just gave myself another 5 minutes to add a little bit more. And this is what I came up with. And the new parts are highlighted in blue. So cutting their teeth in the dead of night. The musicians are doing that. If you don't know that expression, cutting their teeth, it means they're kind of working hard at the basic steps, kind of grinding, if you will. And so that's what that means. And I thought maybe that might help you see it better. And then I added this other line: bright night lights bounce off of booming brass. So I wanted you to picture the nights of the nightclub in a cool jazz nightclub, and the lights bouncing off of their instruments, their brass instruments. And then I brought in some more words from the original, my original pre-writing. So we got cutting, night, night, lights. And then I didn't feel like I had enough of a shift. And so this probably still isn't enough, but I'm working towards it, right? I'm kind of building my craft. So I added music belonging to big, unseen, and forgotten people. I added this little piece here. And, you know, jazz music was really big in the 20s and 30s. And a lot of the pioneer jazz musicians were people of color, Black musicians, and you know, they kind of were unseen, and they're kind of forgotten now, right? Like we don't talk about it anymore, even though they were giants, big people. Some of the best musicians ever were some of these jazz musicians. And so this is my shift of kind of getting to something a little bit more serious. Like it's not just about the fun music, it's about the people that made this music, and giving them their due, right? Their props as some of the greatest musicians of all time. So I'm starting to a shift here. Now, I kind of feel this poem. I'm kind of vibing on it. I got a lot out of that pre-writing activity with playing with some words. And I might use this for my multimedia project. But I'll be honest with you, my first thought was to do the topic of sports, probably basketball, because that's my favorite sport. And I already had some ideas about that. So now I'm torn. I'm like, okay, do I do this poem and then make my focus not sports and make it music or jazz? So now I have decisions to do as a writer. Maybe I keep working on this and this becomes one of my portfolio pieces, or maybe this was just a fun writing activity and I'm like, cool, that was fun. Maybe I'll go back to that later, and I'm going to work on my idea for sports that I kind of already had. So that's your choice as the writer. Kind of, do you want to pursue this some more or let it go? I'll also let you know that these words in this poem have nothing to do with music or jazz. It has to do with growing up and kind of reflecting on being a child and kind of all the help you needed. And then as you get older, not so much. So it doesn't have to be on that topic at all. All right. The point of this exercise is just for you to get some words down like I did, kind of get a topic going, and then just see where that topic takes you. All right. So go ahead, take some time to do a draft. And like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect. You might add to it later, or after you played with it a little bit, you might scrap the whole thing and realize you're going to write about something else. That's okay too. All of that's part of the writing process.